Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, let's go to England. Haven't been in England in ages. I'm going to go to Salisbury, where I've never been before, and we're going to talk to somebody that I have been really keen to meet. This is Ben Rollins, and I've just been stealing time from my other duties to keep reading his book. I feel like I'm sneaking around reading something I'm not supposed to spend time on, but I just can't help it because he writes so well. Ben Rollins is, from his voice, I say, a British writer. I've had about 3 sentences exchanged with him. It sounds very British to me. And he has a wonderful book called The Tree Line, The Last Forest and the Future of Life on Earth. That's an ominous title, but it fits, unfortunately, with some of my own misgivings about where we're headed. So I want to talk about that. But he has 2 previous books that are not at all about trees. One is about the Congo, Radio Congo, Signals of Hope from Africa's Deadliest War. And another one called City of Thorns, 9 Lives in the World's Largest Refugee Camp. Each of those would be worth a whole conversation, but we have only one conversation today, and this one is going to be about trees in the Arctic, because Ben has made a tour of the tree line around the world's the top of the world, and has been looking at where trees grow, where they shouldn't grow, and why they are growing where they don't belong. Is that the best way to put it, Ben?
I think that's a very good summary, yes.
Good. All right, let's talk about that, because I want to say that you're really a wonderful writer. It's just a lovely experience, immersing myself in your choice of words. So I've enjoyed the pleasure of a lovely style of writing, and very, very interesting examples of life in the far north, in places that I've never been and frankly have no desire to go to. But you did. So let's talk about that. I want you to give me a world tour of the tree line of our planet. Where did you start? Why did you think of doing this? And we'll certainly discuss what you found along the way. So, how did it all happen?
Well, you mentioned those earlier books about Congo and the world's biggest refugee camp in Kenya, with refugees from Somalia. And the connection with those is that both of them were, in fact, about environmental degradation and how people were coping and adapting in the face of massive changes to their habitat. So in Congo, deforestation and flooding and war, and obviously war driven by resource extraction and so on. And then in Somalia, I think looking back now, we will see a lot of those natural disasters in the Horn of Africa as the sort of early warnings of climate change and climate impacts, because now drought is becoming an annual occurrence. At that time, it was, I think, like the 4th or the 5th drought in the last couple of decades. But it's increasing. And all of those people living in refugee camps in northern Kenya, 500,000 people. It's a city the size of Bristol, or I don't know what town in North America what city is 500,000, but it's big.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do they call that camp?
They call it Dadaab. And Dadaab means the rocky hard place in Somalia.
D-A-M?
It's D-A-D, double-A-B, excuse me. Dadaab, D-A-D-double-A-B. But I think the connection with the Arctic and the tree line is I wanted to get a glimpse of another part of the world where climate change is already underway, where we can see how humans are adapting and some of the choices and some of the kind of emotional and psychological adjustments they're making, which we will soon have to make. So that was really why I went north. And to give you the tour, I started in Wales, and that image of the trees moving north, really came from studying the long history of the Holocene and the Anthropocene, and how temperatures have fluctuated over time. And I realized that actually the movement of the tree line is a very recent thing. So at the end of the last ice age, like a kind of etch-a-sketch, the ice sheet wiped the northern hemisphere clean, and then when it melted again, hot on its heels came the vegetation, the moss, the grass, and then the pioneer trees, and then the bigger trees in the forests. So every inch of the northern hemisphere has been forested and deforested at least a dozen times, with the ice ages coming and going. So
I'm sorry, it's usually the glaciers that eliminate all the trees, and then they start over?
That's right, exactly. And we're living in a particularly warm moment anyway. Historically, the planet has been much cooler. So I followed the trees to their current position, which in the UK is Scotland. And what I found was that in each location, the tree line is very helpfully divided up into different species. So that suits a book of 7 chapters or 7 species. In Scotland, Scots pine has evolved to be the climax ecosystem. In Scandinavia, it's birch. And in Russia, it's larch. All the way from Europe to the Bering Strait is larch. Then you get to Alaska, and it's spruce. And then into Canada, it's still spruce, but it's interspersed with balsam poplar and tamarack until you get to Quebec. And then in Greenland, the tree line is made up of rowan, mountain ash, and birch again. So you have these very specific ecosystems that have evolved in very specific places. And the story of how that happened and how those particular species triumphed over others each one is an adventure story worth telling. And so that really is the journey that hopefully you've been on reading the book, and others might enjoy as well, is around the world why those trees are where they are, and then to look at what's happening.
Okay, well, now the overall message, though, that I gather, and you don't really hammer on it, at least I would have been on my soapbox more than you. So it's a good thing you wrote the book, not me. Because, my grievance is, we got to stop these damn things. They don't belong there, and they're growing where they don't belong, and they're warming the soil, and they're warming the climate, and it's bad news. So instead of celebrating the triumph of ash trees here or the black spruce someplace else, I am with these guys. I guess what got me onto it was reading a little bit about the Zimovs in Russia. And I don't think you were, seems to me when you got to talking about them, you weren't actually able to get there because there was logistic difficulty with, I don't know, there was a blizzard or something. So you had to do your talk by phone or something with the Zimovs. And they're the main people I would like to get on the show one of these days. I don't know why I haven't done it. Because, they scared the bejabbers out of me when I began reading about how the permafrost is melting, and they largely blame the whole thing on the encroachment of trees in areas where it shouldn't have been, or didn't used to live. Tell me. Right. Now, but I gather that that's really what you believe about the whole Arctic, that this is not good news.
No. So you might think that more trees is good news, because around the world, people are crazily planting trees like there's no tomorrow, because they want to capture more carbon out of the air. But the irony is, in many places, more trees doesn't necessarily mean more carbon sequestration. It also means other things, because nature is complicated. So when you have a warmer environment, trees like the birch in Scandinavia or the larch in Siberia is moving north, And they are, as they go, they are warming the soil, they are trapping more snow. That insulates the soil, that warms the soil further. The permafrost melts, you get earthworms, you get microbial activity, you get more vegetation that increases the process, and so on. You also get other things, like in Alaska, beavers are the largest driver of vegetation change in Alaska, because they eat the new saplings which are coming up on the tundra. They dam the streams. Water conducts heat much better, takes that heat down into the permafrost. You get a feedback loop. So beavers are actually accelerating surface water melt in Alaska. And
you just ruined my day. I had been reading things about how the beavers are our best friends, and we have to bring them back because they're going to restore the fertility of all kinds of barren lands that we've wrecked. So, but that must be in temperate climates.
Well, they do that too. I mean, I think the overall message of my book is that nature is complicated. We have messed with it. We need to learn to live with its grain again, and we desperately need to drag our political and economic systems in alignment with the grain of nature, because we need it. That's where our food comes from. That's where our water comes from. And as we're seeing already this year and last year, drought, floods, etc. So, but like you say, I mean, the easy thing is to get up on the soapbox and shout about it. But most people emotionally find that quite difficult. This is tough stuff to get to grips with. So the whole point of the book was to take you on a lyrical journey, to show you these places. I mean, that's always the goal of travel writing, is to take you there, show you these places, introduce you to these characters, these amazing trees and species, and what they're doing and their long histories and so on, to inspire a bit of awe, a bit of wonder, and at the same time introduce the notions of change and to see what's happening. But hopefully, like you say, not to really hammer it hard, but just to be aware of that, so that then you can start to ask questions. Because it's if you just, there's enough polemics out there. We don't need more of those. We need more.
I'm an activist. Let's not get into a dispute about whether or not my way of living is good, because I can't help it. I can't help it. It's just
I'm the same
this way. You mentioned this, that you're getting earthworms in places where they didn't belong. What are the effects of having earthworms?
Well, earthworms are key activators in keeping soil alive. So the soil, I think it's a familiar thing to say, but in 1 teaspoon of soil, there's 100 million organisms or something. But there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's everything else. And what the earthworms do is they bring air they take air down into the soil. They cycle nutrients. They mix things up. They get life moving. And when that life is moving, that organic matter is transpiring. It's breathing. So it's releasing carbon dioxide. If you have frozen permafrost, it's static. It's not releasing. There's no gas exchange. There's a little bit of melting for maybe 60 days in the summer or something, but then it's frozen again. Once that soil is alive, it's not only releasing all that trapped methane from the past, but it's also transpiring in the carbon cycle. So you're bringing carbon that was locked away, and you're putting it back into the system, into the carbon cycle.
So earthworms actually help return carbon to the atmosphere. Bad guys.
Yeah, they're part of an exchange, So
okay, now I have read, and this I assume must be controversial, or at least not very well established, or we would hear about it every day. I have read someplace that the boreal forest as a whole is now a source and not a sink of carbon. That would, if we're talking, and the boreal forest, of course, I don't know where the southern limit is, but I presume that it's it covers both permafrost areas and farmland, or whatever, places that never have permafrost. Is it where, or how much is known about what amount of forestry and where we can depend on as a way of sequestering carbon?
I think the short answer is it's changing all the time. And whatever assumptions people had 2 years ago, 3 years ago, are suddenly in question now, because the models, it takes a very long time to have a baseline to study how much carbon is being emitted or captured and so on. Over many of these studies are 5 years, 10 years old. So the state of scientific knowledge is always playing catch up with reality, because it takes such a long time to get the baselines, to do the monitoring and all the rest of it. Plus, it's an incredibly hard thing to estimate, because you have, if you look at Siberia as a whole, these are quite crude calculations. They're being based on the number of square miles or kilometers that are burning. They're being based on very lots of samples of trees and what the transpiration rate is, or the respiration rate, or the growth rate, and then they're extrapolating that across the whole of the boreal forest. So that's 1 trillion trees. That's a third of all the trees on planet Earth are in the boreal forest. It more than the Amazon, it is cycling oxygen and carbon for us, for our benefit. So I think if I had any kind of takeaway from my journey, it's that nature is huge and awesome and complicated, and concepts like net zero are meaningless, because trees will always be exchanged. Sometimes they give out much more carbon dioxide when they're stressed, or in a hot summer in the boreal when they're transpiring a lot, or they can't transpire because they don't have water, so they're releasing carbon dioxide, or they're burning. So we can't make any big assumptions about forests, sequestering carbon, saving us from our own global warming. They can do some stuff. They are absolutely part of the carbon system and the oxygen cycle in the planet. But we don't know. I mean, we certainly can't rely on it, and that's the key point, I think, for politics.
I got the idea from the Zimovs that this, and I should say who they are. They are people, a father and son, a scientist. Father's a scientist in Siberia, and the father has been observing the melting of the permafrost and has been concerned for a long time, and has been promoting the idea of reestablishing large herds of huge animals that trample the snow and kick it aside to eat frozen grass throughout the winter, because such herds of animals can keep the soil colder. So, and nobody else has any other good ideas really for how to cool the melting permafrost. Anyway, reading about them gave me the concern that there shouldn't be any additional expansion of trees into the Arctic. And then I read this thing that the Crowther study that came out of Zurich, where they counted these 3 trillion trees that you've mentioned or estimated. And then they gave a map of where they thought we could put an extra 1 trillion trees, which would help reduce global warming by sequestering carbon. So if you look at their map, it shows a lot of the space, or a good part of the space, where they expect trees to be possible and to actually grow would be in the Arctic. They don't warn us there that it's not a good idea. So I got quite agitated 2 or 3 years ago and tried to give a speech at my pugwash meeting, but they thought that was a trivial matter. So they didn't give me enough time to finish. I've been sore ever since. But at any rate, my argument then was that we need to try to be aware that that the Arctic is not the place to encourage any growth of trees, but in fact, quite the opposite. And you don't have any proposals. So far as, I mean, I haven't read your whole book because I have to steal time for myself to peek at it. But I don't think that you have any suggestions of what to do to prevent the further development of forests in the Arctic. And what do you think about the Zimov's plan?
So the Zimovs have, for the benefit of your readers and your watchers, they have a website called Pleistocene Park, which is about recreating the conditions of the Pleistocene era when there was a savanna in Siberia. And they view the taiga forest, the larch tree in particular, as a weed, which was allowed to spring up when the humans killed all the mammoths and the grazing stopped on the tundra. And a tundra that's grazed, of course, doesn't have the trees which trap the snow, which insulate the soil, so it's cooler. And I think, ecologically, it makes a lot of sense. Politically and economically, how you might implement something like that is astonishing. But also, there are some pointers at the end of the book towards how we react to this. And I think the first thing I would say is that we have to accept that a certain amount of warming is committed. We have to begin to adapt. We have to get resilient. We have to invest in all sorts of infrastructure. And I don't just mean flood walls. I mean hospitals, education, transportation, to build resilient societies which are close together, where supply chains are short and where we're not relying on strung out fossil fuels to connect the globe in ways that are not sustainable. So
wait a minute, that's worth looking at, because I can't imagine an Arctic that gets along without fossil fuels. What's the game plan there? How are you going to reduce the dependence on fossil fuels in a place like that?
In many places, the switch from traditional ways of living to fossil fuels is only a generation or two. It's not very long. And I met quite a few people on the journey who were very interested in some of the revival of traditional ways of life, mushing instead of snowmobiles, not herding reindeer with snowmobiles, for example, the Sami in Norway. Of course, we're all entangled. I mean, every square centimeter of everything we own pretty much has some carbon footprint, including our diets. It's not an easy disentanglement, but it's something that I think we're actually going to have to do sooner or later. We're going to be forced to, because when the more extreme impacts hit in some parts of the world, people are going to be without power, without roads, without supply chains, and so on. So these are things. What I'm arguing for, I think, is a shift in attitude towards how we think about it. That we have to consider the status quo as dead and buried, and we have to get ready for what comes next.
Okay, but the status quo includes, for example, in Russia, large cities in the Arctic, and we don't have that in Canada. And you could make a case, I suppose, for all the people in the far north of Canada to shift back to dog sleds, but I don't think many people would do it. But surely you can't even propose that in Novosibirsk or other far north Russian cities.
No, and what's happening there is the infrastructure is collapsing and people are being made homeless, and it's tragic. But if we this is what I mean by investment now, is if we start investing in transition and adaptation now, it's perfectly possible to have geothermal energy, to have hydroelectric energy, to have other alternatives, especially in hard parts of the world where, which are energy intensive, such as the Arctic. That is possible. Railways and so on, electric railways. There's no reason why that sort of infrastructure couldn't be part of the solution. And obviously, it's not going to work anywhere, and I don't have all the answers. All I'm saying is we have to start thinking about that. We have to start preparing for uncertainty. We have to start getting our brains ready for discontinuity. My kids are not going to know the stable sequence of seasons which I knew as a child, and that's a whole challenge to language, to concepts. The spring is the beginning of March. It should be. We've got plants out here in the UK which should be out in April, in May. So this is the beginning, and it's only going to get worse. So it's that getting ready, getting your brain on, getting your head twisted around to cope with that change is
okay. But now let's play with, you dropped the word geothermal. I'm not properly educated about the geothermal, but mostly I think in terms of places like Iceland or places near volcanoes or so on, where you can easily tap into the supply of heat. But I have heard people say that it's possible technologically to use geothermal sources anywhere on Earth if you know what you're doing, or if it'll be harder or something. But that there is, the magma is down there anywhere, from wherever you drill, I guess. Are you thinking that maybe we should look at the development of geothermal sources everywhere in the Arctic? Is that possible?
I think renewable energy has been possible for 50, 60 years, and it's been deliberately sidelined by fossil fuel lobbies and by narrow-minded and short-sighted politicians. And geothermal is definitely part of the mix. Solar for 6 months of the year in the Arctic is completely possible. You've got, the sun doesn't go down,
Yes, I was told, actually, Stephen Salter told me that there's actually more sunshine in the Arctic than at the equator in the summer, or a certain period of the summer, because it's 24 hours a day. Yeah.
And all that energy that's going into the ice cap, it takes a phenomenal amount of energy to melt a cubic meter of ice. Mm-hmm. And that, at the moment, the ice is reflecting a lot of that solar energy back into space. But yeah, you've got solar there, you've got tidal energy, you've got geothermal, you've got hydroelectric, and geothermal is very simple. I mean, you drill a couple of 100 meters down and you get hot water back. It's not complicated, and that's applicable anywhere. But because of this, the systems and the structures that have been built by fossil capital, certainly everybody in the UK pretty much has a gas-fired boiler.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing that I will get back to talking to somebody who's an expert on geothermal one of these days, because I need to know more about it. I've never really understood why, if it's really that easy, just dig a hole and you got your heat, why that isn't cheaper and easier and more accessible than solar and wind. But I'm diverting you from your story. Let's go back to your tour of the Arctic. Where all did you go, and what were the most interesting lifestyle changes that you observed as a result of the changing climate?
I think the most shocking thing was it wasn't just the changing climate, but it's also the sort of the advance of modernity, really, and in Russia, the sort of interesting combination of the collapse of the Soviet Union together with the shifting climate. So, for example, the Nganasan people, there's only about 400 Nganasan speakers left in northern Siberia. And under the Soviet Union, they were collectivized, they herded their reindeer, they had essentially a community that was sort of loosely based on their indigenous way of life. But they also had vets that came in helicopters to inoculate the reindeer herds so that they could be productive.
Really? No kidding.
To the Soviet Union.
Ah.
But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't have any of that support anymore. They were out on the tundra on their own, back in their traditional tents, living as their ancestors had done 100 years ago. But that way of life wasn't sustainable, both from an economic point of view and also from a climatic point of view, because the things were shifting. So now you have people who have flipped from reindeer herding to fishing, and now they drill big holes in the ice and they catch Arctic char and other fish, and that's been a boom economy for the last kind of 10-15 years. But even that now is getting difficult because there are bubbles of methane appearing in the ice on the river and in the sea, which makes the ice like honeycomb and very dangerous to walk on, because the bottom of the seabed is melting, and all of that permafrost, all those hydrates that were trapped in the permafrost on the seabed are coming up, and they're getting trapped in the sea ice. So you have these people have been through three cycles of economic.
These bubbles weaken the sea ice so they can't walk on the ice. Is that what you said? Oh.
Yeah. So they're in danger of. You've got to be very careful.
Is there any danger itself in being exposed to the gas, to the methane? If it bubbles up and you inhale it, is it unhealthful?
I think if you had a big swig of it, probably, but it dissipates into the air as soon as it meets. As soon as...
Let me show you, if I can. I hope I have it here. A current issue of Peace Magazine, which I edit, and this is Katie Anthony in Fairbanks, Alaska, and she makes it her business to go out on these lakes, poke holes in them and set fires to the methane, we're going to be doing a show with her one of these days. Anyway, onward. I'm very interested in the issue of the Arctic sea methane, and I've had Peter Wadhams on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to suggest that book because he sets it all out very clearly.
Yeah. Well, as I understand it, there are people who don't agree with him. And I didn't realize that there was anything controversial about what he was saying, because, I mean, I've seen pictures of these bubbles coming up, but you can't argue about their existence. And so what is controversial about his whole, I don't even want to call it a theory, because he's talking about observable things.
There's no argument that methane is coming out of the permafrost and is coming out of the seabed. The controversy is around the possibility of a big methane release all at once, what they call a methane burp. Mm-hmm. And he says that is a possibility and we can't rule it out. But there are other scientists who say that that's very unlikely, and all we would ever see is a sort of continuous stream of bubbles. We would never see a kind of eruption. But there is evidence to suggest that there have been big spikes in methane in the atmospheric record in the past. And the other thing that I think is interesting this year in particular is that the methane monitoring graph. I can't remember which university it is. I think it's Potsdam. There's a few people I follow on Twitter. If you follow me, and you'll see my retweets if you're interested.
Okay.
That methane curve is going like this, and the methane map. It's very hard to see precisely where it's coming from, but you can see a methane map of the European Union has a satellite, and you can see where it roughly in the world where it's coming from. Just
recently, the last couple of days, I saw a report about a new a satellite monitoring system that's going to be much more precise, and they're going to be able to tell you exactly where these bursts of methane are coming from.
Well, yeah, that's all part of the same, I would imagine, part of the same effort, and it's really important. We need to know, and that will also help pinpoint the fossil fuel extraction sites where they're flaring where they shouldn't be.
Well, they're also all over Siberia. There are these, I believe, about 15 or 20 of these big craters where there has been an explosion from the permafrost of methane, a large amount of it at a blast. It'd be a few square blocks of territory blown out, and some of them are full of water because they quickly turn into little lakes or ponds. But the fact that it's happening on land, and we have obvious evidence of that, makes me wonder why anybody would assume it wouldn't also be happening under the sea. And we might not see that as readily because there's no hole left.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I find Peter Wadham's arguments very credible. And it points to a broader issue, I think, which is that we have, certainly in the mainstream kind of popular media, there is this idea that science is kind of fixed and understood, and our job is to obey the science. And in terms of COVID, the mantra was follow the science. Well, actually, no, science is an ongoing conversation, and people disagree with each other all the time.
Well, go back to telling us what to do. You don't have a soapbox, but I'll lend you mine.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is there's a very little known paragraph in the Paris Agreement, which has been there as part of the International Framework Agreement on Climate Change, I think ever since Rio, which places an obligation on all member states to undertake communication and public education about climate change. And there is no member state that has properly fulfilled that obligation. And if you think of the public education campaigns that governments are capable of when they want to, for example, all of that, the public education and information effort around World War II. In the UK, the most memorable one we had was a campaign against AIDS to spread awareness of the dangers of the AIDS virus. Everybody in the country knew about those. It was broadcast simultaneously on all domestic networks, on all BBC radio. There were massive billboards everywhere. If we had that kind of commitment to education and information, I think the public conversation, the political conversation, what was possible politically would dramatically shift. And if it was also part of that commitment is that climate education should be embedded in the national curriculum. Now, I'm here in my office here. You can't see, there's no logo, but I'm in the office of Black Mountains College, which is a small experimental liberal arts and vocational college that I've founded here in the Black Mountains in the UK.
Let me interrupt you, because there's a Black Mountain College in, I don't know, not Tennessee, North Carolina. Yes. Is it connected to that?
No, but it's inspired by that. So the resonance is in the name that I was very taken with the original Black Mountain College, which went bankrupt in 1953, I think, 56.
Oh, I knew some people who went there. Oh my goodness, that's a sign of how old I am, I guess. Okay,
it was then retained as a kind of small craft center in Asheville, North Carolina. But it was an experimental liberal arts college that brought together all the disciplines in order to have a human education to prepare new citizens who could fight fascism. It was founded in the 30s by refugees from Bauhaus. And my idea here is to have an educational center that brings together all the disciplines with the purpose of action and adaptation on climate change. And that's what we're doing here. So that's why the education, that sort of education and information, I think, is the first step. Beyond that, my former work as a political staffer, I could give you a long list of policy prescriptions that I think every government should be implementing immediately.
What political party were you a staffer for?
The Liberal Democrats in the UK, and also I worked for the Civic United Front in Tanzania for a while.
Oh, okay, good for you.
All so right. That's another story, another book, another time.
Okay, I'll have to have you back several times. Looks like, because what you're doing is exactly compatible with, if not overlapping in the mandate with what I work on, this project Save the World, which does global warming among other things, but we have 5 other issues that we're trying, because we see them as all interdependent. These 6 global threats are, you can't solve any of them without working on at least one of the, sometimes 2 or 3 of the others.
Yeah, there's 3 things. I think there's the information and education. There's the political and economic action in terms of divestment and re-engineering our systems, including taking advantage of all of the very swift changes that have happened in response to Ukraine. For example, divestment is clearly possible at the drop of a hat if you choose. So that set of things. And then the third is the perhaps the softer end of things, is the sort of change of perspective and habit and language, and what I would call the re-entanglement with the natural world. And that's about paying attention and being mindful and intentional, and being aware of your own power to make a difference, because everything that you do matters. So all of those things are the background to the educational program that we're pursuing here. And we do 3 things. So we do short courses, which range from caring for apple trees and thinking about what fruit and vegetables to plant for the next decade or so, to online courses on shareholder activism and climate careers for young people. And then we have residential retreats for different audiences. Then we have vocational education, which is teaching ancient and modern skills that are on the land. So we do no-dig regenerative horticulture, and we do sustainable coppicing and greenwood skills. So that's harvesting the timber without clear felling the forest.
Explain coppicing. That's a word I've come across, but I don't know what it is.
So you cut an ash tree every 10 years. You cut a hazel tree every 7 years. You can cut an oak tree every 20 years, and you take a branch, and then you leave what's called the stool, and the stool regenerates. So a hazel tree is a good example. If you cut a hazel tree every 7 years, it will grow forever. If you leave it alone, it will grow out and die in about 100 years. So humans have evolved harvesting relationships with trees, and we need to get back to that, because a coppiced woodland can produce a lot more timber than a clear fell one where you just grow it for 70 years and then cut it down.
Oh, my word. That is wonderful. My goodness, I am so glad you said that, because it opens all kinds of possibilities. I have been, worried. For example, I'm reading about mass timber. We're going to have a show with some people about mass timber after a bit, where they take pieces of wood and sort of, I don't think it's glue, but they stick them together somehow and make big pillars that you can use instead of concrete to build even high-rise buildings. And I was thinking, oh, well, it's nice, but we're not supposed to be cutting all that wood. Especially old growth trees, you should leave them alone. Well, they said, well, you've got to clear them every now and then because they do die, and then you can take that wood. Well, yes, but that's not enough, I don't think. So if you say that you can just take wood from living trees and let them keep on doing their thing, and while you take the wood and use it for durable products that are going to keep the carbon locked up in it, you've just given me wonderful ideas. Is that something that can be done on a significant scale?
It could be, but it would require a lot, it would require a lot of land, a lot of space. And it's something that was practiced here in England, Wales, and Scotland for many years. If you see those kind of big stately homes in the UK with rolling parkland and then big trees in the fields, usually those big trees are oak trees. And they're very wide girth, but then they have lots of individual branches, and that's because those branches are cut regularly. And so you have some oak stools which are 500 years old, 1,000 years old in some cases. So it's part of the landscape here, but it's a part of the culture that's been forgotten. So our vocational programs are about trying to reactivate some of that relationship with our habitat. And then the last thing we have is a liberal arts interdisciplinary degree program, but that's in development. We're not doing that yet, which will be coming online in hopefully 2023, maybe 2024. And that's really a 3-year bachelor's with ecology, neuroscience, social change, politics, circular economics, and giving you experimental and applied learning to be a change maker in the world.
So this is a really private institution. You're not part of the Red Brick British universities.
It's not. No. We're partnered with a Red Brick university, so our degrees are accredited by them, and all our students can access student loans and tuition loans and everything, just like every other university in the UK. So it's not completely free, but it's also, we're not private.
Oh, well, you sound wonderful. Hey, listen, why don't you get your folks to contribute thoughts, ideas, and postings to Project Save the World's website, because we have pages and pages where we want people, we're trying to encourage greater discourse, people coming in and posting things that they know they've just come across that interest them, or replying to each other. Or you can conduct an argument like the kind we used to have on our old listservs. So it sounds like you have people doing dynamite work that we ought to hear about. And please use our outlet as a way of publicizing what you're doing.
Okay.
Because what you're doing is generating information that the world needs, and that's what I am trying to help facilitate in disseminating.
Okay. We're only 6 months. We're halfway through our first year, so we've got 16 students this year. We're hoping to have about 30 or 40 next year. But I'll let them know, and we'll see what we can do.
Perfect. All right. So now you're doing this college thing. Okay. Now let's go back to your tour of the Arctic. You left me with these poor 400 people in Siberia who are living in tents and not making a go of it. I'm surprised that somebody in Siberia could pull out enough Arctic char and get them onto trains or whatever so as to actually serve a market. Is it possible that anything that's produced in that kind of isolated area could actually be commercially tied into the Russian economy, so that people in Moscow could be eating Arctic char from these folks?
Yes, and they pull out a lot of Arctic char, and it's all frozen, and then they put it onto helicopters. The helicopter comes once a week, and the helicopter comes full of vodka, and they exchange 5 kilos of fish for 1 liter of vodka, and then money changes hands as well.
That doesn't sound like a good deal for them. I'm sorry.
No, it's not. But they do like their vodka. But then they have, there is still 1 herd of reindeer. There's one guy who has 1 herd of reindeer, and that's featured in my book. So they have some reindeer meat, and then of course there are state salaries for things like primary schools and stuff like that. So the town called Sindasco, which is where I visited in the book, is the most northerly settlement in Russia. and I think it's something like 400 people. But
And
they
this is
get
an indigenous group. They have their own language or something.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. There's two groups: the Nganasan and the Dolgans, and there's about 500 of them there.
Okay. Well, are they going to do okay, or what's going to happen to them? You say they're having a hard time now that this Arctic char business isn't.
Well, I think this goes back actually to my point about entanglement, and I think this is relevant to indigenous communities around the north, that because they are closer to the land, because they meet in many cases over 50% of their subsistence needs from the land, they're actually going to be in better shape than people elsewhere who have a more attenuated relationship to their food sources. So if you're relying on a lot of high processed food and from supermarkets, when global war spikes the price of wheat and supply chain shocks mean that the shelves are empty, as we had in my local supermarket here last year, you're in nobody starved, but there's we got stuff. But all I'm saying is global supply chains are fragile. And the people, both in Siberia, in Alaska, the others I met in Canada as well, in Poplar River, still have that knowledge of where the food is in the landscape. And as it changes, they are also updating that knowledge. Because they're entangled with their ecosystems, they are learning as the environment changes. Now, whether that relationship is still tenable as things get hotter, I don't know. But for the moment, in some ways, they're better off because that Arctic char is still there. Now, if it warms so much and the char moves, then it gets harder again. But it's that relationship that I really took away from the Sami in Norway, the Nganasan in Russia, the Anishinaabe in Canada. Mm-hmm. Was that they understand their landscape. They have words for everything. We've forgotten the names of the trees, let alone all the other plants.
Mm-hmm. What about the caribou, or you'd call them reindeer? I think they're kind of the same thing, aren't they? Yeah. And tell me what the changing climate is doing there.
Changing climate is very bad news for the caribou because they need tundra in order to, in the winter, they scrape the snow away and they eat the grass. Now, if that tundra is being invaded with trees, firstly, they can't move amongst the trees because the birch is really thick. Secondly, they get disoriented because they have a fantastic memory for landscape. That's how they travel over huge distances. And when the landscape changes, they get confused, they get lost, they get panicked. The other thing is that then all that heat in the soil melts the snow at the bottom of the snowpack, and then it freezes again. So you get a kind of ice lock on the grass, and they starve. And what's happened in Norway is tens of thousands of reindeer in their herds have died of starvation because they can't eat. And you can't feed that many animals across the landscape with helicopters or aeroplanes or whatever. So it's decimating reindeer. And in Canada, you're seeing, I think similar problems.
Oh, I was not aware of that. Is there any, in principle, is there any solution? Can anybody imagine a technological answer to that?
Well, the Norwegian official who I quote in the book about the reindeer there says the Sami will need to find another lifestyle. That's what he says.
Yes, he's a Sami himself, wasn't he?
Yes. So he's not optimistic about the future of caribou in Scandinavia. I think in Canada it's a different story because you've got a much bigger expanse. And what's interesting in Canada with the contiguous landmass is that species can move. So as the forest moves, species can move, and what you have already actually is some species moving ahead of the forest, so that you've got the grizzlies and the polar bears interbreeding and creating pisleys.
Oh, really? I didn't know they could.
That's
really?
the word they use. Have you not heard that word in?
No.
I came
What
across
is
that
it?
word in Churchill, Manitoba.
What is the word again? Pisleys?
A pisley, a polar bear mated with a grizzly.
And it worked. Oh my goodness.
Apparently, yes.
Wow. That's well, I'm happy for them, but I don't know. Okay. Miscegenation, I guess, is the word for it.
Yes.
Okay. Now, but really, we have I know nothing much about reindeer herding or caribou in Canada, but we did in Peace Magazine have one story about what we call Canada's Pleistocene Park. We've named it that ourselves because the people who run it certainly probably have never heard of Pleistocene Park. But the idea is that there is in Manitoba a park, an area that actually is federally owned, I think, where some indigenous population, I can't remember what tribe they are, but they have a large herd of animals that they somehow have been able to put together and get them to live together, caribou and elk and oh my goodness, I can't. I think this story that is in this article that I just showed you. But if I could think of it, I can't remember which animals, but they have about 5 different wild animals that. I don't think I can find it in time to tell you, but about 5 different species are sort of cohabiting and making quite a large herd. And I've been trying to get an interview with the man who looks after them, but he doesn't speak either English or French. So that's unusual, or at least not enough to be interviewed. I want to find out more about this. But the question is, if we really believe that the large herds of animals help to keep the soil cold, then we should be encouraging such experiments as that. And you've really kind of disturbed me with the notion that they couldn't survive because the ice would form and they couldn't get at the grass. Is this a big enough problem and widespread enough to mean that the whole proposal of encouraging large herds of animals would never work?
What you need is sub-zero temperatures for the whole of winter. So in Siberia, it is still sub-zero from November to April, more or less. So that works because you need the snow in order for the reindeer to get at the grazing. The snowpack has to be like sand. It has to have no moisture in it so they can scrape it away. If it's wet, then the moisture content obviously starts entering the snow a little bit below zero, so minus 3, minus 5. So you have to guarantee that winter is going to be cold enough. And what you're seeing in many parts, certainly in Scandinavia and in some parts of Alaska, is you don't get the consistency of cold. So you get the freeze-thaw. And when you have a freeze-thaw pattern, that's very dangerous for reindeer.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And at least there's hope in Siberia. I don't know whether I guess the people in Manitoba are making a go of it. So let's see how long that holds up. This has been wonderful. I really enjoy this conversation, and I really wish you good luck with Black Mountain College and all the other things that you're doing. Let's stay in touch to some extent, one way or another. Okay?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk.
All good wishes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode number 422. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.